Have you ever thought, is there such a thing as having too much? Beyond just feeling full after a big meal, we're talking about resources like wealth and income. It sounds pretty simple, but it gets complicated really fast. Today, we're taking a deep dive into limitarianism, a really fascinating concept that explores exactly that. Our focus is an academic article by Dick Timmer, Limitarianism, Upper Limits and Minimal Thresholds, published in Res Publica. It really gets into the, let's say, conceptual structure of this idea. What does excess resources even mean? Our goal here is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from this deep dive to help you quickly grasp this complex idea.
Yeah, and what's truly compelling here is that limitarianism, which is a view famously coined by Ingrid Robbins, isn't just about shuffling wealth around. It fundamentally proposes there's an upper limit to how many resources anyone can permissibly have. Full stop. Anything above that, well, that's defined as excess. And the core idea really is that possessing these excess resources is morally impermissible. This particular deep dive, as you said, leans heavily into the conceptual structure. What are the main claims? What are the distributive implications?
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. So, what is limitarianism at its heart? What's the fundamental shift it proposes compared to, say, other ideas about justice?
Well, at its core, limitarianism is the belief that there's an upper limit, a cap. On resources, think income, think wealth that anyone can permissibly possess. The article really highlights that these excess resources should then be redistributed to meet urgent unmet needs or maybe to alleviate significant political inequalities. The real shift, I think, is declaring that resources beyond this limit aren't just a lot, they're morally impermissible to hold, especially when you have these really pressing needs or other societal goals at stake.
Wow, yeah, that's a powerful statement. Impermissible. The article also emphasizes two key features, describing limitarianism as both a partial and an instrumental view. What do those terms actually mean for understanding this?
All right, that's an important insight from the paper. So when we say it's a partial view, it means limitarianism isn't claiming to be a complete standalone theory of distributive justice. It doesn't say a distribution is only just if no one has too many resources. That's not the claim. Instead, it has to be combined with other principles that guide how resources are distributed below that upper limit. As Robbins herself puts it, it can be combined with different views of what justice requires below the threshold.
Okay, so it's like one piece of a larger puzzle for a just society, not the whole solution itself.
Got it.
And what about it being an instrumental view? That sounds interesting.
Exactly. It's just a piece. And the instrumental part. Yeah, this is where it gets particularly interesting, I think, because it clarifies the why. The purpose behind setting a limit. Limitarianism doesn't limit resources just for the sake of limiting them. That would be odd. It does so to promote other important non-limitarian values. Think about promoting political equality, less concentrated power, perhaps. Or meeting urgent needs, having resources available for basic necessities. Or even supporting things like individual autonomy, freedom, or self-respect for everyone. The idea is that the underlying moral values, the reasons why having excess resources is deemed impermissible, those values will also offer at least some guidance on how resources should be distributed below the threshold, too. So the limit is a tool, really, not an end in itself.
A tool to achieve other goals. That makes sense. It's fascinating how limitarianism defines this upper limit. Wait, and it naturally makes you think about the other end of the spectrum, the idea of a minimal threshold, right? Like what we see in sufficientarianism, the idea that everyone should have enough. How does the article use this comparison, this contrast, to deepen our understanding of limitarianism?
Yeah, it's a really crucial comparison the article draws out. So minimal thresholds, as you said, they're kind of the opposite of upper limits. They denote the point below which people just don't have enough. Basic needs are met, maybe. Sufficientarianism, for instance, is strongly committed to these. It believes people have really weighty, maybe even non-instrumental, reasons to secure at least enough to meet this baseline threshold. Now, the article highlights how both views deal with moral value, but in opposing ways. For minimal thresholds, benefits below that line are often seen as far more important, sometimes with lexical priority, meaning they trump everything else, compared to benefits above the line. Limitarianism takes a similarly strong but mirrored stance. It claims it's impermissible to have resources above the upper limit, which implies that providing resources below that limit always has priority over providing resources above it. So making this comparison is vital. It helps us understand the fundamental nature of limitarianism, helps assess its different versions, and tackle tricky questions like, well, how do we actually set the upper limit? Or how do we resolve conflicts between the values it serves?
Okay, that contrast is really helpful. Priority below the minimum versus priority below the maximum in limitarianism. So if there's this upper limit, does that imply it's somehow valuable for people to reach it? To get right up to that line, the article dives into two really distinct ways of thinking about excess resources, and it brings in these two key concepts, the riches line and the limitarian threshold. Could you define both of those for us and explain why they might or might not overlap? Let's maybe start with the zero weight idea.
Absolutely. This distinction is pretty central to the article's analysis. So think of the riches line first. This is the point where, for a specific individual, getting more resources, more money, more wealth, simply stops contributing meaningfully to their personal flourishing or well-being. It just doesn't make their life better anymore in a deep sense. Now, according to the zero-weight conception of excess resources, resources above this riches line are said to have zero moral value for the person holding them. Robbins suggests this might be because they no longer contribute to that person's flourishing. So in effect, it almost turns the upper limit into a kind of high minimal threshold for a flourishing life. Below it is good, above it is neutral for the holder. The limitarian threshold, on the other hand, is a distinct concept. It's the point at which holding more resources becomes morally impermissible, not just valueless, but wrong.
Ah, okay. Valueless versus impermissible. That's a critical distinction. So the article then raises this question. If resources simply lack moral value for the holder above that riches line, does that automatically make them excess and therefore impermissible to possess? Or is there, like, another step needed in the argument?
Exactly. Not necessarily. That's what the source material argues. The impermissibility isn't solely explained just by a lack of moral value for the holder. That's not quite enough. It's also about, well, can these resources be used to fulfill other valuable moral ideals, like helping those in need? Or perhaps do these excess resources actually endanger those ideals? Like undermining democracy. Remember, limitarianism is presented as an instrumental view. So it needs to justify why the riches line, where resources supposedly lose value for the individual, should perfectly coincide with the limitarian threshold, where holding them becomes morally impermissible. Those two lines might not be the same.
Right. So what are the arguments for making them overlap? It seems kind of intuitive, maybe, if it's not doing you any good and others need it.
Well, the argument for overlap is pretty much that intuition. It seems like a neat place to set the limit. If resources genuinely lack moral value for the holder, there seems to be no good reason for them to keep those resources, especially when urgent needs are unmet elsewhere. And setting a limit lower than the riches line would seem counterproductive, right? It would prevent people from reaching a fully flourishing life, which isn't the goal.
Okay, that makes sense. But I can immediately see reasons why they might not overlap. What does the article say about arguments against this neat alignment?
It explores those too. The main counterargument stems from that instrumental nature again. Limitarianism might need to set the limit differently based on promoting other specific values. For instance, the level of wealth that starts to seriously undermine democratic institutions. That might be different from the level where wealth stops contributing to an individual's personal flourishing. Those could be two very different numbers. Plus, the article notes public opinion and political feasibility might come into play. People might support limits, but perhaps favor limits higher than a strict riches line based on flourishing might suggest. So the core point the article makes here is, even for this zero-weight view, the justification for where you set the upper limit, the limitarian threshold, it fundamentally depends on the broader moral ideals. Limitarianism seeks to promote democracy, meeting needs, etc., not just on the idea of individual flourishing itself.
That clarifies the zero-weight view and its complexities a lot, thanks. Now let's turn to the alternative the article presents, the outweighed conception. This sounds like a fundamentally different way of thinking about what makes resources excess.
Precisely. It's a different pathway to the same conclusion that there's too much. The outweighed conception argues that, well, maybe these excess resources do still have some moral value for the holder. Maybe they do contribute something to their life, even if it's just luxury or convenience. But, and this is the crucial part, the holder's claim to keep those resources is simply outweighed by other, more pressing normative concerns. Other moral reasons win out. So even if someone does benefit from having, say, a second $1 billion, their claim to that second billion isn't strong enough when you weigh it against other moral priorities.
Like meeting the basic needs of millions or preventing the super wealthy from capturing the political system.
Exactly. Those other moral priorities just carry more weight in the balance.
Okay, so under outweighed, it's not about the resources lacking value to the holder, but about a conflict of values where other concerns take precedence. What does this imply then about whether it's valuable for an individual to reach the upper limit? Is there any sense of achieving something good by getting to the limit?
That's a key difference. Crucially, the outweighed view does not imply it's valuable for an individual to reach the upper limit. Not at all. Think about Robbins' democratic argument again. If owning, say, over $1 billion is deemed to undermine democratic values because of the immense political influence it buys, then that's why it's impermissible. The reason for the limit is the negative external effect. It's not about the person having enough for themselves or the money lacking value to them. It's about having too much in a way that actively disrupts or harms a critical moral ideal like democracy. So redistribution in this case isn't aimed at bringing people closer to the limit as if the limit itself is a desirable state. It's aimed at addressing the harm caused by the very existence of such excess concentration of resources, taking away the danger, essentially.
That makes perfect sense, especially for the democratic argument, taking away the danger. But hold on, if the goal is simply promoting values and mitigating harm caused by extreme wealth, why bother with defining a specific limitarian threshold at all? Couldn't we just use, say, really steep progressive taxation or other policies without formally saying this amount is impermissible?
That's a really important objection, and the article definitely addresses it. It acknowledges that limitarianism, precisely because it's an instrumental view, must demonstrate that setting a specific threshold is actually the best or most effective way to promote these values, better than just, say, very high marginal tax rates or other regulations. Now, while the outweighed view might make the exact location of the threshold seem a bit less stable or maybe harder to pin down compared to the zero-weight view, its advantage is that it avoids what some see as a problematic claim. The idea that resources completely lose all moral value for the holder above a certain point. That could be hard to defend. So Outweighed offers a robust alternative framework. It focuses on the comparison of claims and the impact of wealth, which might be seen as more plausible by some.
Okay, so we've got these two ways of thinking about excess resources, zero weight and outweighed. Very clear now. Now, let's get practical. The big question. What do we actually do with these excess resources, according to limitarians? What are the implications for policy, for institutional design? How does the article suggest these ideas translate into action?
Right, the what now question. So once we identify resources as excess, limitarians can pursue a few different, though related, goals. They might aim to minimize the number of people who possess excess resources. Or they might aim to minimize the total amount of excess resources floating around in society. Or perhaps more likely, they'd try to balance both of those aims. The specific choice here, again, depends entirely on the instrumental values limitarianism is trying to promote in that context. For example, if strictly capping individual resources somehow meant fewer total resources ended up being available for redistribution to meet urgent needs, maybe due to economic effects, that's a trade-off a limitarian focused on needs would have to seriously consider.
I see. So the goal itself isn't monolithic. And what about the actual policy tools, the mechanisms? Does the article discuss different approaches to implementing these limits?
It does. It highlights two main policy approaches that have been discussed in the literature. First, there's what you might call orthodox limitarianism. This is closer to what Robbins initially proposed. It essentially suggests a 100% top marginal tax rate above the defined threshold, whether that's the richest line or another point. Basically, all wealth or income above that threshold is taxed away, a hard cap. Then there's weak limitarianism. Thinkers like Volaku and Dumitru suggest maybe using revenue-maximizing tax policies instead. The idea here is that maybe a slightly lower tax rate actually brings in more total revenue for redistribution. This approach might be more effective if your primary goal is meeting unmet urgent needs, for example. Simply taking away all the money above the line doesn't automatically guarantee the biggest pot for helping others. It's about maximizing the positive impact.
That's a pragmatic consideration. Does the underlying reason for being limitarian, the needs argument versus the democracy argument, influence which policy is better?
Absolutely. The source material illustrates this really well, how the moral argument shapes the policy preference. If you're motivated by the needs argument, you tend to see excess resources primarily as wasted. They're wasted because they could be used much more effectively to alleviate poverty or meet basic needs. This view might be slightly more tolerant of the temporary possession of excess wealth, perhaps, if that possession somehow indirectly helps meet needs, maybe through investment or philanthropy, although that's debated. But if you're motivated by the democratic argument, you see excess resources primarily as dangerous. Their very existence or concentration poses a threat to democratic institutions through things like lobbying, media control, undue influence. This view is naturally going to be far less tolerant of the mere existence of that excess wealth. It wants to eliminate the danger.
Wasted versus dangerous. That's a stark contrast. And are taxes the only tool? Does the article mention other types of policies?
No, taxes aren't the only tool. The article makes an important distinction, especially relevant to the democratic argument. It distinguishes between redistributive policies and predistributive policies. Redistributive policies are what we usually think of first. They target resources people have already acquired above the limit. Think wealth taxes, high-income taxes. The goal is to reallocate that existing wealth. Predistributive policies, on the other hand, aim to prevent excess resources from accumulating in the first place. They try to shape the initial distribution of holdings and opportunities. Think about things like strong inheritance taxes, maybe limits on corporate power, policies that promote worker ownership, things that make it harder for extreme wealth to build up. The Democratic argument, for example, might find predistributive policies particularly attractive because they aim to create structures where vast democracy-distorting wealth accumulation is just less likely from the get-go. It's about preventing the problem rather than just treating the symptoms after the fact.
That distinction between fixing it after redistribution and preventing it before predistribution is really significant. It points to different philosophical priorities even within limitarianism itself. Okay, one final point the article brings up, and this one seems quite specific. It applies particularly to those who endorse the zero-weight view we discussed earlier. It's this idea of distributing risk among those who are already wealthy. Can you elaborate on that? It sounds a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is a subtle point, but an important detail for that specific zero-weight perspective. The article draws an analogy here back to sufficientarianism. Remember how sufficientarians are really concerned about people falling below the minimal threshold, falling out of having enough? Well, zero-weight limitarians, who believe it's actually valuable for individuals to reach a fully flourishing life, which they associate with the riches line, they must, by analogy, be concerned about those people who are just above that riches line. Why? Because those individuals run a higher risk of falling back below the line, maybe due to economic shocks, illness, bad luck, compared to people who are way, way above the line, the super rich.
Ah, I see. So even among the rich, some are closer to the edge of not flourishing than others.
Exactly. They are flourishing now, according to the zero-weight definition, but their position is more precarious. Therefore, the article suggests, if you're a zero-weight limitarian, your policies for dealing with excess resources, those above the riches line limitarian threshold, should also consider minimizing this risk. The risk of people inadvertently falling back below the level needed for a flourishing life. This might mean perhaps favoring progressive taxation even above the threshold, so the tax burden wouldn't fall equally hard on someone just over the line compared to someone vastly over it. It lessens the burden on those closer to the line, helping to ensure they can maintain their flourishing life even while you're still dealing with the excess resources further up. It's about managing stability right around that crucial boundary.
Wow, okay. That adds another layer of complexity, thinking about risk even among the wealthy. What a deep dive this has been. We've really unpacked limitarianism. We understand it now as this partial and instrumental view. It seeks to set an upper limit on resources, but not just for the sake of it, right? But to promote these other essential values like political equality or meeting urgent human needs.
Absolutely. And we've explored those two key ways of thinking about excess resources. Either they have literally zero moral value for the person holding them the zero-weight idea, or maybe they have some value, but the person's claim to them is simply outweighed by other more significant societal concerns, the outweighed view. And we saw how these different concepts and the specific moral ideals driving the libertarian view, whether it's about needs or democracy, how they profoundly shape the preferred policy approaches, whether that's orthodox 100% taxes or maybe weaker revenue-maximizing taxes, or even those predistributive measures designed to stop the accumulation happening in the first place.
Yeah, it's become really clear this isn't just some simplistic slogan about taking from the rich. Not at all. It's actually a deeply nuanced philosophical debate. It gets right to the heart of the structure of a just society and how we try to balance, individual holdings and individual flourishing with collective well-being and shared values. It forces us to ask some really fundamental questions. What is the true purpose of wealth in our society? When does accumulation serve us, and when might it start to harm us?
And that really leads to an important question maybe for you, the listener, to ponder after this deep dive. In a world that's visibly grappling with vast inequalities and facing really pressing global issues, how might adopting a limitarian perspective, even just considering it, even in its partial and instrumental form, how might that fundamentally shift our conversations, shift them away from only asking how much is enough, towards also seriously asking the question, how much is too much?
How much is too much? Definitely something to chew on. Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating and complex deep dive.